said, what we're going to focus on tonight is improving hay and forage quality. And when we think about, well, what's the benefit of doing that? Well, benefits are going to be those animals are going to perform better, and ultimately we're going to need less supplemental protein and less supplemental energy, which is going to help us from an economic standpoint on the operation. So when we think about forage quality, there's a lot of things that can go into forage quality. From a nutrition standpoint, the two big things I'm going to focus on is TDN, or total digestible nutrients, and that's one measurement of energy. So when I say TDN or energy, realize I'm using those terms interchangeably. And there's a lot of other ways we could describe energy. You could use digestible energy or metabolizable energy or net energy. But all that, when we're talking about beef cattle, starts with TDN, and we'll work from there. So I'm going to go ahead and use TDN. The other major nutrient component we're going to talk about is crude protein. And that's what a lot of people focus on, but especially when we're in East Texas or Central Texas and we're dealing with introduced forages, energy tends to be a bigger challenge, or that TDN tends to be a bigger challenge for us than what protein does when we think about it from a supplementation standpoint. A couple things we want to think about from forage quality as far as how it's going to impact intake of that forage. So how much can those animals consume, whether it's hay or whether they're grazing. When we're dealing with low quality forages, they're not able to eat very much. That's kind of a misconception out there that some cattle producers have, is it's okay if my hay's not very good, the cows will just eat more. Well, in actuality, they eat less of it, so we see a bigger deficit there. And then obviously the opposite's going to be true when we're dealing with higher quality forage. Those animals are able to eat a little more because they can digest it faster and pass it through the system. And so we'll see more intake and higher levels of performance on that better quality forage. So when we think about some basics of forage quality, I just want to have a quick discussion on cell contents versus cell wall. So when we think about a plant cell, it's made up of these two major components. So everything that would be inside the cell walls, which we would call the cell contents, and then the cell wall on the outside. Now, the things we'll see inside the cell contents would be things like soluble carbohydrate, starch, some of our protein, a little bit of lipid, and then some organic acids as well. When we think about the cell wall, that's going to contain pectin, cellulose, hemicellulose. Those are the two big components. So when you hear people talk about fiber, that's what we're really talking about there, is cellulose or hemicellulose. And then lignin, and lignin is actually a negative because it reduces fiber digestibility. So when we think about lignin, think about if we were building a concrete structure. If we just have the cement and we don't have any rebarb in it, it's pretty weak. It's pretty easy to break up. If we have that rebarb in there and you're trying to bust it up, you know how much stronger that concrete is. Well, think about lignin being the rebarb in that plant cell wall. So the more lignin we have, the lower quality it's going to be. Cutin, which is just a wax, silica, tannins, and then some polyphenols. But the big thing we're going to think about in that cell wall is going to be the cellulose, the hemicellulose. That's where a lot of the energy is coming from. And then the lignin, which reduces that digestibility. So when we look at digestibility a little bit more, when we think about the cell contents, they're typically going to be 90 to 100% digestible. And if we're looking at a hay or a forage test report, where you'll see that represented is in what we call non-fibrous carbohydrates, or NFC. There's a lot of labs that unfortunately don't report that, but one of the labs I'm going to talk about later tonight, you will see that on their reports. When we look at that cell wall, the digestibility of the cellulose and hemicellulose varies tremendously depending on how much lignin that plant has. And we'll see that digestibility range from about 40 to 75%. Now, when we're looking on that test report, one term we'll see is NDF, or neutral detergent fiber. And what's going to be represented in that fraction is going to be that cellulose, that hemicellulose, and lignin. And as I mentioned a minute ago, that NDF fraction of that plant, when we analyze it, is going to represent the major source of energy in most of the forages that we're dealing with. And so one thing that happens as those plants mature, when we're dealing with a very immature plant, we'll have a lot of cell contents in relation to that cell wall. So a lot of the more digestible components and less of the components that are less digestible. As those plants get older, as those plants mature, we see that cell wall increase and we see the cell contents decrease. So the digestibility of that plant's actually going to go down at that point in time. Now, another thing we want to think about is not as important as a lot of the other things we talk about, but from a quality standpoint, palatability is important, especially in a grazing situation, because some of those forages that are more palatable, those cows tend to graze out or overgraze. The ones that are less palatable, they won't graze quite as much. And then we want to make sure that that forager, especially when we're thinking about hay, is going to be free or have minimal amounts of toxic compounds, and that could be things like nitrates or cyanogenic glycosides, which can get converted into hydrogen cyanide, or what some people refer to as prussic acid, or other toxic compounds. Nitrates tend to be the big one we think about. We want to make sure there's no or minimal amounts of mold, weeds, and brush, and then any kind of foreign objects. So when we think about what factors are going to affect that hay or forage quality, there's a long list of them, but some of the ones we're going to focus on tonight is going to be species and cultivar, and that's definitely going to have the biggest effect, and we'll look at that here in a minute. And then maturity has an extremely big effect on quality. And then we start looking at things like temperature, nitrogen fertilizer, whether that hay got rained on when it was in the windrow, or whether that hay got put up maybe a little bit too wet. So when we think about those species or those varieties or cultivars, some generalizations that we can make is cool season forages are going to be higher in quality, and really we're thinking about digestibility or TDN here. Those cool season forages are going to be higher quality than our warm season forages, generally speaking. Annual forages are going to be higher quality than perennial forages. And if we think about that, what's going on there is that perennial forage is trying to make itself really strong, that it can last for years and years and years. Whereas those annual forages, they're coming back from seed every year. And since they're coming back from seed, they're more worried about just making seed again. So they don't put as much energy into making a strong cell wall. And so that's why we see a little higher digestibility in those annuals than we do in the perennials. We can also see a little difference in environments. So generally speaking, arid environments, so if we were to get out west, those forages tend to be a little higher quality than what we see in humid, high rainfall type environments. Now, the other thing we'll do is we'll look at these forages. So we'll put them in groups. Are they a warm season perennial? Are they a warm season annual? Are they a cool season annual? And we'll look at some examples of those. And also, if we were grazing those forages, what we might expect from an average daily gain standpoint. Now you can see I have cool season perennials crossed out. And the reason that is when we look in Texas, we just don't really have any cool season perennials. There's a little bit in a few select locations, but our environment is just not conducive to growing cool season perennials. So when we think about those warm season perennial forages, and remember that perennial forage is a forage that's going to grow every year. We don't have to replant it, or it doesn't have to come back from seed. So those would be things like Tifton 85, which is actually a cross between Bermuda grass and star grass. So we talk about it as Tifton 85 Bermuda grass, but realize it's actually that cross between Bermuda grass and star grass. And then we have all the varieties of Bermuda grass, whether that's common, coastal, jigs, Alicia. Bahia grass would be a warm season forage, and then old world blue stems. And don't get those confused with little blue stem or or big blue stem. They're totally different forages. They actually came over from Asia. The examples of those old world blue stems would be things like King Ranch blue stem, Clayburgh blue stem, are the one we most commonly see now that's planted is going to be WW Beedall. Now, all these forages on this slide would all be what we would refer to as introduced forages, meaning they're not native to the U.S. We brought them in from another country. When we look at our warm season annual forages, some things we would think about would be our sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, straight Sudan grass, pearl millet, crabgrass, and crabgrass can be very polarizing. Some people really like it and some people really don't like it. From a grazing standpoint, it can be a very high quality forage, as I'll show you here in a minute. Where sometimes it gets a bad rap is if we're dealing with Bermuda grass hay, that crabgrass dries a little slower, so it can be a little frustrating when we're making hay. One thing to realize, or you may already be aware of if you have some friends or family in certain parts of Oklahoma, it's very common for them to plant crabgrass in a wheat crabgrass rotation up there. Just going to mention briefly, when we're looking at some of our warm season annuals, whether that's Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan hybrids, forage sorghums, pearl millet, and even corn, some of those varieties have been bred to have what we call the brown midrib trait. So if we look at the leaves in this picture, this is a typical leaf, and you see that midrib is kind of white in color. This one that's been bred with that brown midrib trait is going to have a brownish color to it. Sometimes it's a darker yellow, but most of the time it'll look like that. What's been done with those breeding programs is that actually reduce either how much lignin is in those varieties or how that lignin is bonded to the cellulose and hemicellulose, and so we see an improvement in digestibility. Just to kind of give you an idea of how much difference that can be, I actually did my master's research up in Amarillo looking at grazing at sorghum Sudan hybrids, what would be the same variety either with or without the mutation in it, or a similar variety with and without the mutation in it. And we saw on average about a 1/4 pound increase in average daily gain just to using the variety with the brown midrib trait in it. Now, when we think about our cool season annuals, those would be things like small grain rye, oats, wheat. We would refer to those as cereal grains, and then also ryegrass. And realize there's a big difference between small grain rye and ryegrass. A lot of you may have volunteer ryegrass that comes back year after year without you planting it. So when we look at some of the performance we would expect, which would be indicative of the quality differences we see in these forages, is when we look at warm season perennials like Tifton 85 or Old World blue stems, under moderate grazing conditions, we would expect average daily gain to be somewhere between about 1 pound and 1.6 pounds a day. The Old World blue stem, we actually see some pretty good performance out of those varieties, especially the Beedall there, if we manage it correctly. Now, if we look at our hybrid Bermuda grass and our Bahia grass, and they're going to be very similar under moderate grazing conditions on growing animals, we'd expect 3/4 pound to 1 pound a day. If we're really doing a good job of managing those forages and letting those animals be very selective, we may get up to 1.25 pounds a day. Now, when we look at our warm season annual forages, you'll quickly notice we see much better performance than what we do on our perennial forages. So that sorghum Sudan grass, or just a straight Sudan grass, we'll see anywhere between about 2 and 2.75 pounds a day. We used to see quite a bit of sorghum Sudan grass put up for hay in certain parts of the northern portions of East Texas or Central Texas until the sugarcane aphid really causes a problem. So we don't see quite as much there. Some really high quality forage there that if we're able to use, we can get some great value out of. When we look at crabgrass, it'll actually be somewhere between about 1.25 pounds and 2 pounds a day. The same thing with pearl millet. So you can see that crabgrass is actually better quality than our Bermuda grass. Now, it won't yield as much. Like I said, it's a little more challenging grazing, making hay, but from a grazing standpoint, we can see really good performance out of that. Now, when we look at our cool season our cool season annual forages, that's where we see the highest quality of all the forages we deal with. So that ryegrass, those small grains, we would expect to see somewhere between about 1.5 pounds and 2.85 pounds a day. And so the same thing that comes into hay. So a question that came up a month or two ago quite often is, well, what about ryegrass hay? And generally, if we're dealing with ryegrass, and ryegrass is a little different than the small grains, it'll hold quality a little longer. But even if that ryegrass has a seed head on it, as long as it hasn't started to turn brown or yellow on you, we will typically see pretty good TDN values out of it, a lot of times better than what we'll see out of our Bermuda grass. So that ryegrass hay may not be as palatable sometimes as a Bermuda grass hay, but from a TDN standpoint, typically is going to be higher in TDN. Now, you may be wondering about what about the cool season perennials? Like I mentioned, we don't have any of those that really fit our environment here, but just to give you some perspective, they would be lower in average daily gain than what we see out of our annuals, and considerably lower. We're talking 0.5 pound or more less typically. So our cool season annual forages are going to be the highest quality forages we're going to have available. So that's taking a look at species and cultivar. The next thing I told you has a major impact is going to be maturity. This happens to be some work out of Georgia by Dr. Glenn Burton. Dr. Burton is actually the gentleman who bred both Coastal as well as Tifton 85. And so what they looked at in one of these studies was what happens to quality as well as what happens to yield if we cut that forage every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks, every 5 weeks, every 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or 12 weeks. So you can see if they cut it every 3 weeks, they're cutting several times throughout the year or the growing season. If they're only cutting it every 12 weeks, they're probably only getting 2 cuttings there, maybe 1 cutting. If we look at that TDN, and they actually measured dry matter digestibility, which is going to be very similar. So I just kind of converted that to TDN to make it a little easier to look at. If we're cutting every 3 weeks on average, it was going to be about 65% TDN. At 4 weeks, about 62. 5 weeks, about 59. 6 weeks continues to go down. 12 weeks, and that's still pretty good for 12 weeks. A lot of hay I see will be even lower than that, will be in that 45 to 48 range on TDN. So you can see that quality drops off pretty quickly as those plants start to mature. And we'll see the same thing with protein. Even if you fertilized it well, we're going to see that same decrease. Now, one thing that's interesting to look at is how does this cutting interval affect yield? And you would expect to see the same thing if we were grazing this rather than cutting it, if you were grazing it too hard. So if they cut every 3 weeks, they only got about 8 tons in yield. By reducing their cutting interval to every 4 weeks, they increase their yield by about 1.5 tons. Well, what's going on there? Well, we give that plant a little more time to grow, and between cuttings, and when we do that, it builds more leaf. As it builds more leaf and stem, it has a greater area to photosynthesize, so it grows even faster. Plus, every time we cut that forage or we graze that forage short, we're going to stop that root growth for a while, and so it takes a while for that growth to come back. And what we see is from 3 weeks to 5 weeks, we continue to increase yield. After that, cutting it less frequently, we don't improve yield anymore. So that forage gets to a point where leaving it, we're not going to get any more meaningful growth out of it, but we're going to see it continue to decrease in digestibility and protein content. So what does that tell us? To optimize both yield and TDN or quality of that forage to kind of hit that point where they cross and we can get good levels of both. We really want to look at trying to cut those forages about every 28 to 30 days. If we go a little longer than that, not a huge deal, but we don't want to go much longer than that because our quality is going to drop quite a bit. Realize you're not going to make as many bales, but if we make better quality, we won't make as many bales per cutting, but if we make better quality, we're not going to have to feed protein and energy supplements at all, potentially, or less of them moving forward. A question that often comes up, well, what if I'm having a custom baler do it? They don't want to come in as frequently. And that's understandable, but what you may want to visit with them about is tell them that you'd be willing to pay them a couple dollars more per bale if they'll come cut yours sooner or put you at the top of the list so that forage doesn't get more mature. A lot of times they're willing to do that, and it did cost you a little bit more, but when you run the numbers, you're going to come out ahead in the long run doing that. So if you're baling your own, you have more flexibility. If you're having it custom done, just look at some ways to get that done in a little more timely fashion. So this next slide is pretty surprising and a lot of times when you see it for the first time. And what we see here is they were looking at coastal Bermuda grass, common Bermuda grass, and Pensacola Bahia grass. And this was a grazing study where they're going out sampling in the pasture, but we'd expect the exact same thing with hay. Is you can see quality or digestibility was very high in the spring. When we get into the summer, it goes down. When we get into the fall, it starts to go back up and then level off. And what's happening here is the majority of our plants, as it gets hotter, those plants are going to produce more lignin. As they produce more lignin, they're going to go down in digestibility and go down in TDN. So if we're making 4 cuttings a year of hay, a lot of people are going to want that second and third cutting because they tend to be the prettiest. But in reality, if we're dealing with cattle, that first cutting and fourth cutting are often going to be higher quality. So that's something to keep in mind when you're buying hay or when you're selling that hay. And also, if you're going to put part of the hay in the barn, if you need to make that decision before you have it analyzed, just remember that first cutting, that fourth cutting tend to be higher quality than what the second and third will because of those higher temperatures we see during the summer and that increase in lignin. And that's going to happen regardless of what the rainfall is. So even if we had a pivot running on that forage, we're still going to see that decrease during the summer due to that temperature effect. Fertilizer is one that often comes up quite a bit. And what I really want to focus here is on nitrogen fertilizer specifically. With the majority of our forages out there, as we increase that nitrogen fertilizer, we are going to increase the protein content and we will increase the yield. We're not really going to have any impact or very little impact on TDN. So nitrogen is really just focusing on the protein, and there's not an advantage in having 20% protein versus 15% protein per se when we're feeding it to cattle. So don't go crazy on wanting the highest protein. Now, do we want to put some more nitrogen fertilizer out there to increase our yield? And is that cost effective? Absolutely, that's something we want to look at. The other thing is if we have some more nitrogen fertilizer, that forage grows faster, so you're willing to cut it sooner. And if you're willing to cut it sooner, it will be a little less mature, so we can have an indirect effect on TDN, but no direct effects on TDN. One thing I would caution you about is all the hay you see advertised will often say it's well fertilized. What does that really mean? If you're buying hay and somebody has it advertised like that, I would really want to ask some more questions and see what that means, because it definitely doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. Now, mention what happens if the hay gets rained on. How's that going to affect the quality? So if we have some hay that we cut and it's set in the windrow and let's say it gets a 1/4 inch of rainfall on it, or it gets a 1/2 inch of rainfall even. What we're going to see happen in that situation is the protein content is actually going to go up and the energy content is going to go down. Now, let me say that again. The protein content, when we get a little bit of rain on that hay in the windrow, is going to go up and the energy is going to go down. The reason that protein content goes up is we wash some of the soluble carbohydrates out of that forage. We'll wash some of the minerals, especially potassium, back out of that forage. So if we remove those two things, that causes the remaining components to actually increase in concentration. We hadn't added any protein in that hay. We've just falsely increased it because we washed some of those other things out. I mentioned that from the standpoint, a lot of times when people think of forage quality, they just want to focus on protein. Well, if that's all you focus on is protein, it can be very misleading, especially if that hay got rained on. And I would never want to let it get rained on intentionally just to try to increase that protein because of how much energy we're going to lose. Now, on the flip side, if we got a heavy rain on that hay, we got 1.5 inches, 2 inches on it, maybe even an inch, we will actually see both the protein and the TDN go down in that situation. But light rain will actually see that protein go up. And with experience, if you look at enough samples, you can actually start picking out the ones that got rained on based on some of those relationships we see, and especially that non-fibrous carbohydrates I mentioned earlier. What happens if we put that hay up a little too wet? So we really want, for most of the hay we're putting up in big bales to be 15% moisture or less, is if we put it up too wet, we can have what's called a Maillard reaction or a non-enzymatic browning reaction. And what we see in that situation is heat is produced from fermentation of that wet hay, and we get a condensation reaction of those soluble carbohydrates, those sugar residues with amino acids, and amino acids are part of the building blocks for protein, but we get this complex that's indigestible. Okay, so it's still going to show up as protein, but it's going to be indigestible to that animal. The way we would measure that is through something called ADICP, or acid detergent insoluble crude protein, and I'm going to show you on a hay test later where we would look to see. And if we're using some of the more progressive labs around the country, they're going to test for that. Unfortunately, the majority of the labs, including many of the university labs, do not test for ADICP, so we can't pick that up in those labs. And what's going to happen is if that ADICP level is too high, we'll actually adjust the crude protein down a little bit. What you may see in those bales of hay, so this was some grain sorghum that got baled up one year when hay was in short supply due to a drought. And you kind of see the edges here that kind of have this burnt appearance to them. That's that Maillard reaction. And then you can see that bale's actually kind of falling apart there. Now, if you smell that, it'll have kind of a sweet smell, almost like caramel, or some people would describe it as a tobacco type smell. If you've ever caramelized food when you're cooking, that's the exact same reaction that's going on here. So it's very palatable to those animals. They'll eat it very well generally, but it's going to be lower in quality because we've tied up some of the soluble carbohydrates as well as some of the protein. Another indication sometimes, if you see bales that are really kind of squatting like this, that kind of shrink after we bale them, that can be another indication that that hay was put up a little too wet and we have a Maillard reaction. It could be because the density on those bales was set very, very loose, but more often than not, if you see that, that's going to be an indication that we had a Maillard reaction going on because that hay was put up a little bit too wet. Now, if we think about from a grazing standpoint, what impact does a frost have on a forage quality? It's really not going to have any impact. All that frost is going to do is stop that forage from growing. It's not going to hurt the quality. Now, after we get that frost, what's going to affect quality then is how much rain we're getting. So if we're thinking about stockpiling some Bermuda grass or Bahia grass in East Texas or higher rainfall areas of Central Texas, as we get more rain on that stockpile forage, we will see it start to decrease in quality as well as palatability in that situation. But the frost isn't hurting the quality, the frost is just stopping it from growing. Now, and that's especially the case with their introduced forages. If we get out in West Texas where we're looking at some native forages like little blue stem or big blue stem, those forages will hold quality from a TDN standpoint very well after they stop growing, but they will drop in protein content, whereas their introduced forages, that Bermuda grass, that Bahia grass, those old world blue stems, they'll hold protein a little bit better, but will drop TDN quite a bit more. So how do we go about determining hay quality? So when we're thinking about hay, we want to sample each cutting or each load of that hay, because depending on when it was cut, depending on how mature it was, depending on what the species and what varieties we have in there, that's going to change that quality. So we want to sample each cutting or load. We want to make sure we get a good estimate of TDN and crude protein. Now, when we're looking at TDN, I won't bore you with all the details, but we want to use a lab that uses what we call a summative equation to calculate TDN. And they're going to look at the various fractions of that plant. We're going to get an estimate of digestibility and use that to calculate TDN. And the main components, they're going to look at a whole lot more, but the main components that are going to be critical to get that good estimate of TDN are going to be NDF, that neutral detergent fiber. We want to get an estimate of that NDF digestibility. We actually want to measure the ash content. And what ash is that's going to represent the minerals in that forage, as well as if we're dealing with any hay, any dirt or soil contamination. Crude protein actually figures into the TDN of that forage, and then the ADICP to look at if we have that Maillard reaction going on. So when we think about testing that hay, we definitely want to use a hay probe so we get a good cross-section representation of that hay. There's two main types of hay probes out there. What we would call a drill type that has a cutting blade on the end, and you either use a hand crank or a battery operated or electric powered drill to take a core from that sample. Or what's in this picture is what I actually prefer is called a push type hay probe. This one in the picture happens to be my favorite. It's one out of Canada, but we actually take that and you can manually push it into the bale. The only time I've ever had a problem with that was with some really, really, really low quality Bahia grass. It's pretty hard to push, but we have good quality forage. It's really easy to push in there, and we can get a sample much quicker. And then this particular one, it drops into that plastic bag, and you have a little bit bigger push surface on it. This one's a little more expensive here. Here's another option. This would probably be my second favorite. In some situations, it's actually a little nicer than the other one because it's easier to transport, but this is another push type hay probe, but it's set up where the PVC pipe here, you actually unscrew the core, the stainless steel coring part, you flip it around and it'll go back in the case and serve as its own container. And then your sample just drops in the tube, you unscrew it, drop it into a bag after you get them all poured in when you get ready to sample that other level. So you can look at purchasing a hay probe yourself. They can be a good investment, or visit with your county agent. Sometimes they have one that you can borrow from them. So when we look at sending that hay off to a lab, what I would strongly encourage you to do is visit with whoever you're going to be seeking advice from a supplementation standpoint, and see where they recommend sending that hay off to get it analyzed, and then what tests would be appropriate. And then some things we kind of want to look at that gives us an indication that of labs that tend to do a better quality job is you should see a column for as fed and a column for dry matter. What we mean by as fed is what's the concentration of those different chemical components with the water included in the sample, so with that moisture included. On a dry matter basis, we've taken the moisture out, and that's really what we want to look at when we're looking at nutrient requirements and we want to compare this hay to another hay, or we want to compare this hay to silage, or we want to compare this hay to baleage. As always, look at the dry matter numbers. Like I said, the good labs will show you both a dry matter and an as-fed number. But what I want to show you real quick is here's the importance of making sure we get the right test done, and we're using that summative equation. This was actually a sample back from 2011 during that drought. I was working with the county agent. He was working with the producer. We got the sample, sent it off to the lab, came back at 57% TDN. But I noticed one of the tests that we wanted included ash. For whatever reason, got left off, whether it didn't get put on the submittal form or whatever happened there. So called the county agent, said, hey, call the lab. They should still have that sample. Go ahead and have them run an ash on it, and then let's look at what the analysis is then. So typically forages are going to run about 6 to 8% ash is what we would expect on most. When we got this sample back, it was actually running 18% ash. This was a sample on some corn stalks that somebody got very aggressive with the rake and threw quite a bit of dirt in that sample. That's why we see that higher ash content. So when we corrected for that, that's going to drop that TDN from 57 down to 46%. So a huge drop in quality. And so that's why we can't just send a sample off to any lab and get a result back. We got to get it sent off to the labs that are using the better techniques and make sure we get the appropriate test on those forages so we don't overfeed or underfeed those animals if we need to supplement them. I'm going to tell you a lab that I send all my personal samples to, as well as any research samples, is going to be the Dairy One Forage Lab in Ithaca, New York. Really good turnaround time. Depending on what test we need run, they'll have results within 24 hours of that sample hitting the lab. In some situations, it may take 7 to 9 days if we're doing some certain wet chemistry analysis. And I won't bore you with wet chemistry and NIR, but just quickly, wet chemistry will work on all samples, but it's more expensive and it takes longer. It's kind of the gold standard. But if we run enough samples with wet chemistry, we can actually then scan those samples with an NIR machine that measures how much infrared light is absorbed or reflected. And based on how much light is absorbed or reflected, we can estimate those components and get a good value for TDN there. I'll tell you what, Dairy One, when it comes to Bermuda grass, I've sent them the same sample and had them analyze it, wet chemistry and NIR, without them knowing it was the same sample, just to make sure we were getting good numbers, and I was comfortable with that before recommending the NIR on Bermuda grass, and all those tests on Bermuda grass came back really well. But like I said a while ago, just visit with whatever nutritionist you're going to seek recommendations from and find out what lab they would like used or would recommend used in that situation, and then what's going to be the most appropriate test for that hay sample you're looking at. So when we get the report back, and this is an example from a report from Dairy One, what do we want to focus on? Because there's a lot of information on here and it can get a little overwhelming at times. But what I suggest producers focus on is this adjusted crude protein. So not the crude protein, but the adjusted crude protein. Now, if we look over here, they're actually going to be the same. We'll see 12.2 on both the crude protein and the adjusted crude protein. That tells me that we didn't have any heat damage. That ADICP number was low enough to indicate we didn't have any heat damage, so they didn't have to adjust that protein down. If we did have some heat damage from that hay getting put up too wet, we would actually see that adjusted crude protein lower than the crude protein. The other main thing we want to focus on is the TDN. Here you can see it would be 54%. I mentioned the NFC earlier. That's one thing I'll look at to give me an indication if maybe that hay got rained on potentially. So we've sent that forage or that hay sample off to the lab. We got the results back. How do we tell if it's good, average, low quality hay? Well, what we want to do is compare it to the nutrient requirements of cows we're dealing with, because that'll let us know, do we need to provide additional supplement, or is that hay good enough on its own where we don't have to? And if we'll do a good job on putting hay up, we can actually get hay that's good enough where we don't have to feed any kind of protein or energy supplement. We don't have to feed any cues. We don't have to use any liquid feed or something else. So if we're looking at a 2-year-old lactating female at peak lactation, when she's producing the most amount of milk, which is going to be about 60 days after calving for a beef cow, she would need hay or a diet, if we let her eat all she wanted, that was about 11.5% protein and about 60% TDN to meet her requirements. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of people want to brag, well, I got 18% crude protein hay. Well, that's fine, but this cow's only needing 11.5%. What they really need to be bragging about is what's the TDN of that hay. Now that TDN is for her not to lose or gain any weight. She's just kind of holding steady. If we look at 3-year-old lactating cows and mature cows at peak lactation, they're going to need about 12.5% protein, 61% TDN. If we look at a 3-year-old, a couple weeks before she gets ready to calve, about 9% protein, 58% TDN. Mature cow, about 2 weeks before calving, 8.5% protein, 55% TDN. So we can use these nutrient requirements to judge how good that hay is. Now the key is going to be is these TDN values I'm showing you here, those are only going to be valid if we're using a lab that's using a summative equation and has a good estimate of TDN there. Unfortunately, I've seen a lab here in East Texas the last couple years that was overestimating TDN of hay by 15 to 20 points. So hay that at best would be 58, 60% TDN based on when it was cut and varieties, they were estimating it at 80% TDN or 75% TDN. If that's the case and you went off that, you're not going to supplement those animals when you likely needed to, and they're not going to perform. So when we're comparing the nutrient requirements to our hay quality, it's important that we're using a lab that's giving us a good estimate of TDN. So that's what we would do from a hay standpoint. What about from a pasture standpoint, as those animals are grazing and we kind of want to get an idea of what that quality is? It's really not practical to send those samples off to the lab. Instead, what we want to think about is forage species. So think about those cool season forages being higher quality than the warm season forages, the annuals being higher quality than the perennials, and those average daily gains we thought about earlier. What are our growing conditions? So is it in the spring, is it in the fall, or is it in the middle of summer when it's really hot? And then one thing we can look at to give a good idea on protein content as far as what those animals are consuming in that forage is those manure patties. So when we see that manure patty like this one that hits the ground and splatters, that tells us that forage has plenty of protein. We wouldn't need to supplement any protein in that situation. Doesn't tell us everything about energy or TDN, but chances are if we're seeing that, we're going to expect the TDN to be pretty high as well. On the contrast of that, if we see that manure patty that's stacking up and getting pretty tall and firm like the one on the bottom left-hand corner here, that tells us that forage is pretty low in protein and those animals can benefit from a protein supplement standpoint. So hay, we want to send it off and get it analyzed from pasture. We're going to look at fecal consistency. We're going to look at growing conditions and we're going to look at forage species. So we can take what we know about forage quality, what impacts it, to make sure that forage those animals are grazing is going to be higher in quality, as well as that hay we put up is going to be higher in quality. The last thing I want to mention here quickly is stocking rates and what impact that's going to have on forage quality and animal performance. So when we think about animal performance, we think about average daily gain. So when we have low grazing pressure, they're being able to select what they want. We're going to see high performance. When they can't select as much, we see that performance go down. The other thing we think about, especially like in a stocker operation, is what's our performance per acre? How many pounds of gain we're getting per acre? We'd call it gain per acre. What we see is when we're stocked low and we're not grazing too heavy, we're going to be in this range. When we're stocked high and overgrazing, we got more animals out there, but they're not gaining as much, so we don't get as much performance per acre. Kind of a balance is where we want to be with that. There's a question that came up, and let me finish on stocking rate here, and then we'll come back and get that question answered. Just want to show you the results from a study that was done at the Overton Research and Extension Center by Dr. Monty Roquette. This was actually 2 years of data looking at stocking rates on rye and ryegrass overseeded on Bermuda grass. They grazed for just short of 160 days, put almost 270 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. That's a lot more than most people would typically put, so we want to keep that in mind when we look at the gain per acre here in a second. But what I really want you to see on this next slide is going to be average daily gain. So the stocking rates, and these were steers that weighed about 600 pounds, a low of 1.6 head per acre, 960 pounds of animals per acre. And these traps were bigger. That's how you end up with the fraction of an animal there when you convert it to per acre. Medium of 2.2 or high of 2.8. What I want you to really notice here is as we increase that stocking rate, our average daily gain went from 2.95 pounds a day down to less than a pound a day. That's where overgrazing, that animal doesn't have as much of that high quality forage to consume. And so we're negatively impacting forage quality in that situation by grazing too heavily. So our grazing management can have a big impact on our forage quality and thus our performance as well. So one of the questions that came in is, would there ever be a good time to test forage that you're grazing? Not generally. The only time I would think about that is if we were having some kind of a problem from a mineral imbalance standpoint or something like that, or from a research setting if we were dealing with a new species that wasn't commonly used in that area or a new variety. But as a producer, generally there's not going to be a time where I'm going to suggest we test that forage or grazing. And a big reason we're probably not going to do that is because that forage is going to be changing pretty quickly. And so it's not real useful from a management standpoint because of how that forage changes. Hopefully that answers that question. If not, feel free to type it back in or go ahead and unmute and ask, and we can discuss that in more detail. The next question that came up is this session being recorded and will it be available for viewing later? And yes, it is being recorded. You've seen that. It should have popped up on your screen to let you know it was being recorded, especially if you want to ask a question here in a second. We will post that later to a YouTube site called East Texas Extension Forage, and I'll send that out either later this evening or tomorrow with that link. Now, the one from tonight, it's going to probably take a few days to get that posted, but the previous beef and forage workshops from the Ag and Evening series are on that website, so you can look at them there if you're interested in that. Any other questions?
I do have one more question. It's a little bit about forage quality. It's a little off topic, but it happened this week, so it's good timing. Is someone left the gate open to the baleage, and we had about 200 bales of ryegrass, and about 60 of them got messed up, bitten into. Wrap came off in different places. We taped up as many as we could. We're feeding out, even though we have grass. We're going to feed out what we can as quick as we can. But what do you see? Do you see some of those same effects when baleage gets some oxygen into it, or should we write it off, or okay to feed?
You have to be careful with it. What we're going to see when that baleage gets oxygen to it, because that plastic wrap has been broken, is we're going to see quite a bit of mold growth and quite a bit of deterioration of the dry matter. So definitely you want to feed it as quick as you can. I would try to unroll it, rather than feeding it in a ring. So those areas that are spoiled, those animals can pick around those and eat that better quality forage, but it is going to drop pretty quickly, and you'll see quite a bit of deterioration in that sample. Does that answer that question, Colorado?
Yep, appreciate it.
Okay.
So yeah, it definitely won't take long to spoil in 90 degrees.
Not at all. And even if we had cooler temperatures, just because of the oxygen exposure, it'll cause it to spoil pretty quickly. And I'm glad you asked that question, because that reminded me of something I had planned on mentioning earlier and I neglected to, is hay versus baleage. And just quickly, what baleage is. So hay, we talk about putting up at less than about 15% moisture. Baleage, we're actually going to put that up with quite a bit of moisture. Typically, we're shooting around about 50% moisture. We're going to make that bale just like we normally would, but then we're going to wrap it in plastic to prevent the oxygen from getting exposed to it. And that it'll go through a fermentation process that's similar to silage, but since it's an anaerobic fermentation, we get some lactic acid produced that will prevent further fermentation. And as long as we don't have oxygen get exposed to that, that will maintain that quality. Now, there's a big misconception with baleage, that baleage is going to be higher quality than hay. If we cut those forages under the same conditions, they've been grown under the same conditions, we would expect the baleage and the hay to be similar in quality. So if I can ever make hay, I always want to make hay. That's going to be more cost effective. I don't have to make as many bales to put up the same amount of tonnage and those kind of things. But where the baleage really comes into play is especially in the spring of the year, when we have more ryegrass and we know what to do with, and we don't have conditions where we can really get it dry, then baleage works really well in that situation. Another question that came in is, what is the difference between a killing frost versus a frost? What we'll see with the frost sometimes, depending on what the species is it'll ding the plant and you may see the top leaves burn, but as the temperatures warm back up, that plant will continue to grow. So we had a frost, but it actually didn't stop growth for that growing season. Whereas a killing frost doesn't kill the plant permanently when we're talking about a perennial forage like Bermuda grass, but it kills it from the standpoint we won't see any further growth from that season. So that's really the only difference there. Another question that came in, is there a max number of pounds of nitrogen to apply at one time on coastal Bermuda grass? Just typically from a utilization and effectiveness standpoint, typically if we're talking about hay, I'm probably going to be shooting somewhere about 90 to 100 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. You could put a little bit more than that depending on what your soil type is. And as long as your soil type has a high enough cation exchange capacity where it can hold on to that nitrogen, Bermuda grass, as long as we're not limited on potassium, we're not limited on other plant nutrients, we're not limited on rainfall, will continue to respond up to in excess of 400 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. But from a practical standpoint, we're probably going to be shooting around 100. If you went 150, as long as you weren't in a super sandy soil, that would probably be okay. But I'd be shooting for that 90 to 100. Any other questions or any follow-ups? to some of those questions that were asked. All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so I'll turn it over to Joe here in a second. We just had one that came in. How do you determine the last cutting date? It's really going to depend on your situation and if there's enough forage out there to cut. And if you're able to graze it versus if you have to bale it because you can't. So you'll see people that'll cut hay in early to mid-October sometimes. Nothing wrong with that. If it's a place where we can't graze it, then I would definitely look at that, no problem. A couple of years ago, because of the rain we had, we even had hay getting cut in December after we already had a frost on it and it wasn't growing anymore. Now, obviously, if it's been sitting there a long time after that frost, that quality is going to go down. But if it's in a situation where we can't graze it, then you could cut it that late if you want. But practically speaking, we're typically going to be thinking about sometime in September. Now, what I would want to do rather than taking that very last cutting of growth off there, if it's a place I could graze, I would rather do what we call stockpile forage. So with stockpiled forage, and the exact date's going to vary a little bit depending on how far north or how far south you are in the state. But if we kind of think about I-20 and then an hour or so south of I-20, then for stockpile forage, I would want to have that forage either grazed off or cut for hay sometime around the 1st of September, hit it with about 60 pounds of actual nitrogen, let it grow from the 1st of September to frost, typically about November 15th. And yes, that is a little longer window than what we would think about during the heart of the growing season, but because of those cooler temperatures, that forage is going to grow slower. And also because of those cooler temperatures, that quality doesn't drop as quick. And so if we'll let it grow from the first part of September to that first frost, then after frost, we can go ahead and graze it. That's going to be much more efficient than cutting for hay because we don't have those equipment costs. We don't have those baling costs. So that's kind of how I would think about that last cutting date. Another question did come in. If cutting a field for hay, what nutrients are lost? And what would I suggest reapplying fertilizer to regain those? So we will see some loss of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but the two big ones by far are going to be nitrogen and potassium, and I'm always going to replace those, especially if we're dealing with Bermuda grass. Potassium is very important. Dr. Olson's actually going to talk about that in one of the upcoming sessions about stands of Bermuda grass that have declined some. If that potassium gets low, we'll see those stands decline. For me, if I'm going to replace it, that next fertilization, I'm going to put, like say, if I put 90 pounds of nitrogen, I would probably want to put roughly about 60 pounds of potash per acre. I may or may not put a little bit of phosphorus depending on my soil type. A lot of soils and have plenty of phosphorus in them, and especially if you've ever used poultry litter in the past, you probably have plenty of phosphorus and don't need to put that. If you want to put a few pounds of phosphorus for each ton of forage you remove, that would be fine. But nitrogen and especially potassium is what I would really look at putting back out there. Question is, what's the best time to do this after cutting? As soon after cutting as possible, depending on what nitrogen source you're using. So if we can use ammonium nitrate, that really is not going to have any meaningful amount of volatilization and can sit there for weeks if we don't get any rain without losing any of it, I'd put it on immediately. If we're doing urea, then I'm going to watch rain a little bit closer. If I have some rain coming, I want to go ahead and get it put out there. Also, if you can get some agrotane put on it or another urease inhibitor product that prevents the urease from converting the urea to ammonia, you could go ahead and put it out there a little quicker. The potassium is not going to matter. We won't ever lose it. But generally speaking, I'm going to try to put it out just as soon after rain as I can. Urea in the spring, I'd put it out right away again. during the middle of summer, I may be looking at my long range forecast and adjusting off of that if I was using it for urea. All right, well, I don't see anything else. So like Joe said, thank you for joining us tonight, and everybody have a good evening.